You ever get kicked off your own land and realize the person calling the cops has no idea what they just started? The first thing I saw was the lights, red and blue flashing across the surface of the lake like it belonged to someone else. Ripples cutting through reflections I'd been staring at since I was 10 years old. The smell of damp cedar and cold water still hanging in the air as I stood there holding a tent stake in my hand, while an officer stepped out of his cruiser and told me to pack it up because this was now private HOA property. And for a second, I just stared at him, not angry, not confused. Just listening to the way the words sounded coming out of his mouth like they'd been rehearsed, like someone had fed him a script. And that's when I saw her, Deborah Whitmore, standing 10 yards back on the gravel path with her arms crossed, and that polished smile that never quite reached her eyes, the kind of smile that said she'd already decided how this story ended. She tilted her head just enough to make it look like sympathy, but her voice cut clean through the quiet when she said the lake was part of the community now, that I needed to respect the rules like everyone else. And the thing is, I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because of how wrong she was, because beneath that water, beneath that shoreline, beneath every dock her HOA had started building, there were lines on a map older than her entire subdivision, lines my grandfather had walked himself with a surveyor back in 1964, lines that didn't disappear just because someone printed new signs and bolted them into the dirt. But I didn't say any of that. I didn't pull the documents out of my truck, didn't argue with the officer, didn't raise my voice. I just nodded like I understood, like I was just another guy who got in over his head, because sometimes the fastest way to win is to let the other side believe they already have. So I pulled the last stake out of the ground, folded the canvas slow, feeling the grit of sand against my palms, listening to Deborah's heels crunch against the gravel as she walked closer, probably expecting a fight, probably hoping for one. But all she got was silence, and that seemed to bother her more than anything. The officer gave me a warning, told me not to come back without HOA permission, and I thanked him, real polite, like this was all reasonable, like I hadn't just been told to leave a lake that carried my family name on county records. And when I finally turned to walk back toward my truck, I caught my reflection in the water, stretched and broken by the ripples from their headlights, and I remember thinking how strange it was that something could look so different depending on who was standing at the edge of it, because to them it was a community feature, a selling point, something to raise property values. But to me it was a system, a controlled body of water with one inlet, one outlet, and one legal access point that every single one of them depended on without even realizing it. And as I closed the tailgate and heard Deborah behind me reminding the officer to document everything, I just smiled to myself. Not big, not obvious, just enough to feel it settle in. Because what she didn't understand, what none of them understood, was that they hadn't taken my lake, they'd just stepped onto it. And 3 weeks from that moment, every single thing they thought they owned was going to depend on whether I decided to let them keep it. The drive back was quiet except for the low hum of my engine and the soft rattle of gravel under the tires, and I kept replaying the way she said community lake like she had stamped it into reality just by saying it out loud, like decades of ownership could be rewritten with a meeting vote and a printed sign. But the deeper I thought about it, the clearer it got. This was never about the lake itself. It was about control, about access, about who got to decide who belonged and who did not. And Deborah had built her whole little kingdom on the assumption that nobody would ever challenge that, especially not someone who looked like they had just been pushed off their own land without a fight. I pulled into my driveway and cut the engine, the ticking of hot metal filling the silence as the night air settled in, cool and damp, carrying that same faint scent of water from a mile away. And I sat there for a minute with my hands still on the wheel, thinking about my grandfather, about the way he used to walk that shoreline at sunrise with a thermos of coffee and a folded map tucked under his arm. He used to say land does not lie. People do. And if you know where to look, the truth is always right there under your feet. I got out, walked into the house, and went straight past the kitchen to the back office where I kept the old files. The metal cabinet groaned when I opened it, drawers packed tight with folders that smelled like dust and time. I pulled out the one labeled water rights and set it on the desk, flipping through page after page of stamped documents, survey sketches, handwritten notes in my grandfather's steady block letters. Every line a piece of something bigger, every detail a thread that tied that lake back to us. Not to an HOA, not to a board, not to a group of neighbors who decided to call it theirs, but to a system that had been in place long before any of those houses were even built. I found the original deed, the edges worn soft, the ink still sharp enough to read under the desk lamp. It showed the boundaries clear as day, not just the shoreline but the inlet, the narrow strip of land feeding water into the basin, and more importantly the access road that cut across my property. The only legal route to reach the lake without crossing private land. And that was when it clicked, not all at once, but like gears lining up one by one. Because Deborah could put up all the signs she wanted, she could call it community property. She could even convince local officers that she had authority out there. But none of that changed the fact that every single one of her residents, every dock, every picnic table, every kayak rack they were so proud of, depended on that one access point. And that access point belonged to me. I leaned back in the chair and let that settle in, the quiet weight of it. Not excitement, not anger, just clarity. Because this was not about proving her wrong in front of a cop on a gravel path. This was about letting her build her case until it collapsed under its own assumptions. I pulled out a second folder. This one newer, county records, zoning changes, HOA filings, and I started matching them up against the original documents, line by line, date by date, looking for the gap, the place where they had assumed something that was never actually granted, and it did not take long. A clause buried in the subdivision plan, referencing shared recreational space, but never defining access. Rights, never securing easements, just vague language that worked fine as long as nobody questioned it. I let out a slow breath and closed the folder, the plan forming without me having to force it, because the strongest move here was not to rush in and correct her. It was to wait, to let her expand, to let the HOA invest time, money, and confidence into something they did not actually control. I stood up, walked over to the window, and looked out toward the dark line of trees that hid the lake. From view, knowing exactly what was happening out there even without seeing it, they would be celebrating, talking about improvements, about community events, about how they had secured something valuable, and I almost respected it, the confidence, the certainty, because it made what came next that much cleaner. I turned off the light, leaving the room in shadow, and as I walked out I could already see the next few weeks laid out in my head. Every step quiet, legal, precise, no shouting, no confrontation, just a series of small decisions that would lead them exactly where I needed them to be, because they thought they had taken something from me. But in reality, they had just stepped into a system they did not understand, and the moment I decided to close it, there would be nothing they could do to stop it. I did not go back to the lake the next day, or the day after that. And that was the part that made all of this work. Because people like Deborah expect resistance, they expect arguments, raised voices, maybe even a lawyer's letter too early, something they can push against and frame as unreasonable. But silence confuses them. Silence makes them fill in the gaps with their own assumptions, and within a week I started seeing exactly what I needed to see. Trucks rolling past my road carrying lumber and composite boards, the faint echo of power tools drifting through the trees in the early morning, the sharp smell of fresh cut wood mixing with lake air that had always been clean and untouched. They were building, not just using the shoreline, but investing in it, staking their claim in ways that went far beyond a few signs. And every board they nailed down, every post they set into the ground, was another step deeper into something they did not legally control. I drove past once, slow, windows down, just enough to hear the rhythm of hammers and the low buzz of conversation, and I caught glimpses through the trees, new docks stretching out over the water, a row of kayaks stacked neatly on a rack, even a fire pit circle lined with stone. It would have looked almost impressive if it was not sitting on a foundation that did not belong to them. And that was when I noticed something else, something small but important. Every single person heading in or out of that lake used the same narrow stretch of road that cut across my property. Tires pressed the same path into the dirt, gravel pushed aside in familiar patterns, the kind of where you only see when something becomes routine, predictable, necessary. I stopped at the edge of that road one afternoon and stepped out, the sun high and hot, dust clinging to my boots as I looked down at the tracks, dozens of them layered over each other, cars, small trucks, even a delivery van at some point. All of it confirming what the documents had already told me. They were relying on this access like it was guaranteed, like it had always been theirs. And that confidence was exactly what I needed. Because once something becomes habit, people stop questioning it. they stop checking the details. They assume the ground under their feet will stay exactly where it is. I took a few steps further down the road, listening to the distant laughter coming from the lake, the splash of someone jumping in, the low hum of a portable speaker carrying across the water. It sounded like a community that believed it had secured something permanent. And for a moment, I just stood there and let that sound settle in, not out of resentment, but out of calculation, because every one of those moments was building toward a single point where it would all stop at once. I walked back to my truck and pulled out my phone, not to call anyone, not yet, but to take a few photos, the tire tracks, the entrance point, the way the road connected cleanly from the main street through my land and straight to the shoreline. Simple images. Clear evidence. Nothing dramatic. Just facts. I saved them and set the phone down, already thinking 3 steps ahead. Permits, access rights, enforcement, all of it lined up quietly in the background while Deborah and her HOA focused on what they could see, what they could touch, what they thought they owned. And that night I sat at my desk again with the files spread out in front of me, cross-referencing everything one more time, making sure there were no gaps, no loose ends, because when I moved this forward it had to be precise. It had to be clean, something that could not be argued away with a smile or a meeting vote. I traced the line of that access road with my finger on the survey map, from the main road to the water's edge, and I could almost hear Deborah's voice from that night. Calm, confident, certain she had already won, and I realized that was the real difference between us. She was playing for control in the moment. I was building something that would hold up. When the moment passed, I closed the folder slowly and leaned back, the room quiet except for the soft hum of the air conditioner. And for the first time since that night by the lake, I felt something close to satisfaction, not because anything had happened yet, but because everything was already in motion. They just did not know it, and by the time they realized what that road actually meant, it would already be too late to change it. I waited until the second weekend before I made my next move, not because I needed more proof, but because I wanted them fully comfortable, fully committed, the kind of comfortable where people start inviting friends, posting photos, talking about traditions like something has always been theirs. And that Saturday morning the sound carried farther than usual. Laughter, music, the steady splash of kids running off those brand new docks, the kind of noise that fills a place when people stop thinking of it as borrowed space and start treating it like home. I parked my truck just out of sight and walked the last stretch on foot, boots brushing through dry grass as the sun climbed higher, heat settling in across the land. And when I reached the edge of the tree line, I could see everything clearly for the first time since that night. Deborah standing near the shoreline with a clipboard in her hand like she was managing an event. Neighbors gathered around coolers and folding chairs. A banner tied between 2 posts that read Community Lake Day in bright blue letters. And I stood there for a second taking it all in, not with anger, not even with frustration, just with a kind of quiet observation. Because this was exactly what I needed, every detail, every setup, every assumption playing out in real time. I stepped forward onto the road and let the gravel crunch under my boots. And it did not take long for someone to notice. Conversation slowed, heads turned, and then Deborah saw me, her posture tightening just slightly before that same polished smile snapped back into place. She walked over with that controlled confidence, the kind that comes from thinking the situation is already settled. And she stopped a few feet away like she was setting a boundary without saying it out loud. Ethan, she said, voice calm but firm, you really should not be here without notifying the HOA. We have rules now. And I could hear it again. That word we. Like ownership could be claimed by repetition. I glanced past her toward the lake, the docks, the people, the water moving slow under the sunlight, and then back to her. And for the first time since all this started, I spoke more than a sentence. I said, it looks like you have made some improvements, and she nodded slightly, almost proud, explaining how the community came together, how they invested in making the space better for everyone, how property values were already rising because of it. And I let her talk. Let her build it up, because every word was another layer of commitment, another confirmation that they believed this was secure. When she finished, I nodded once and shifted my weight, letting my boots settle into the dirt of that road. And then I asked her a simple question. How do people get down here? Just like that. No accusation, no edge, just a question. And for a second she hesitated, just enough to notice, before she gestured behind me toward the road. It is the main access, she said. Like it was obvious, like it did not need explaining, and I followed her gesture with my eyes, tracing the path back up through the trees toward the main road. The same path I had walked 100 times growing up, the same line I had traced on those survey maps, and I nodded again, slower this time, like I was confirming something to myself. Then I looked back at her and said that is what I thought, and there was a shift, subtle but real, the kind of moment where something unspoken starts to settle, and even if the person does not fully understand it yet. She straightened slightly, asking if there was a problem, and I shook my head. No problem. Not today, I said it calm, almost casual, and that seemed to relax her just enough for her to dismiss the moment, to assume this was just another attempt that went nowhere. She turned back toward the group, already calling out something about scheduling the next event, already moving on, and I stood there a second longer, listening to the sound of gravel under a passing car heading down toward the lake, another set of tires pressing deeper into that road, reinforcing the same pattern, the same dependence. And then I turned and walked back the way I came, not in a hurry, not looking back, just letting the moment close exactly how it needed to, because everything I needed had just been confirmed out loud, in front of witnesses, in the open. And as I reached my truck and opened the door, I could already feel the timing shift. The waiting was over. The next part was not about observation anymore. It was about action, quiet, legal, and final. And by the time Deborah realized what that simple question actually meant, there would not be a single thing she could do to undo the answer. Monday morning started quiet, the kind of quiet that settles in before anything changes, and I used that to my advantage, because the first move was never going to be loud. It was going to be official. I sat at my desk with the documents laid out in front of me, every page aligned, every detail checked twice, the original deed, the survey maps, the county records, all of it forming a single clear line of ownership that had never been transferred, never been altered, just ignored. And I picked up the phone and made 3 calls, not to Deborah, not to anyone in the HOA, but to the people who actually mattered: county planning, a property attorney, and a surveyor who had worked this area for over 20 years, the kind of man who did not guess, did not assume, just measured and marked what was already there. By noon I was standing at the edge of that access road again. But this time it was different. This time there were stakes going into the ground, bright orange markers spaced out with exact precision, each one defining the boundary they had been crossing without even realizing it. The surveyor moved methodically, tape stretched tight between points, boots pressing into the dirt as he called out measurements in a steady voice. And I watched as that invisible line became something physical, something undeniable. The road they thought was shared cutting clean through land that belonged to me. And when he finished, he handed me the report, simple, direct, no room for interpretation. I thanked him, paid him, and loaded the markers into the back of my truck, leaving just enough in place to make the point clear. Then I drove into town and met with the attorney. A quiet office with the low hum of fluorescent lights and the faint smell of paper and coffee. I laid everything out in front of him, and he took his time going through it, page by page, asking a few questions, confirming dates, tracing lines with his finger the same way I had the night before. And when he leaned back in his chair, there was a slight shift in his expression, not surprise, not excitement, just recognition. He said, "This is clean," which was exactly what I needed to hear. No gray areas, no shared access rights, no easements granted, just a private access road being used without permission. And then we talked about next steps, not aggressive, not rushed, just structured: notice of restricted access, formal documentation filed with the county, enforcement if necessary, all of it designed to stand on its own without needing an argument. I left his office with a folder heavier than when I walked in, not because of the weight of the paper, but because everything was now set in motion. And that afternoon, I stopped by a supply yard on the edge of town, the kind of place that sells heavy gate hardware, steel posts, reinforced hinges, nothing decorative, just functional, built to last. I picked out what I needed without overthinking it. Simple, solid, something that made a statement without saying a word. And as the sun started dropping lower, I drove back to that road one more time, the light hitting the trees at an angle that cast long shadows across the ground. The lake just barely visible through the gaps, calm, unchanged, like it had no idea what was about to happen. I stepped out and walked to the start of the access point, boots settling into the dirt where dozens of others had passed through. And I stood there for a moment, not hesitating, just marking the transition, because everything up until now had been observation, preparation, confirmation. But this was different. This was the point where it stopped being theirs in practice and started becoming mine again in reality. I drove the first post into the ground slow and steady, the sound of metal against earth sharp and clear in the quiet. Each strike deliberate, measured, until it stood firm, then the second, then the third, building the frame one piece at a time, not rushing, not cutting corners, just doing it right. Because when something like this is done properly, it does not need explaining. It speaks for itself, and by the time the first section of that gate was in place, the light had shifted enough that the road behind me was already starting to fade into shadow, and somewhere down near the lake I could still hear faint echoes of voices, distant, unaware, still moving in and out like nothing had changed, and I tightened the last bolt on that hinge and stepped back, looking at the line I had just drawn in the only way that mattered, not on paper, not in conversation, but in the ground itself. And for the first time since Deborah smiled at me behind those flashing lights, I knew exactly how this was going to end, not with an argument, not with a scene, but with a single, quiet fact that nobody could ignore once it was in front of them. The next morning the air felt different before I even reached the road. That quiet tension that settles in when something familiar has shifted overnight. And as I came around the bend I could already see it, the gate standing solid across the entrance, steel catching the early sunlight, a clean line drawn where there had never been one before, and for a few seconds there was nothing, just the sound of wind moving through the trees and the faint ripple of water somewhere beyond. Then the first car rolled up, slow at first like the driver was not sure what they were looking at, tires crunching to a stop just a few feet from the barrier, engine idling, and I stayed back, leaning against my truck, watching it unfold exactly the way I knew it would. The driver stepped out, walked up to the gate, looked at the posts, the hinges, the lock, then glanced down at the ground like the answer might be written there. Confusion first, then frustration. Then the second car pulled in behind him, and then a third, a small line forming in minutes where there had been constant movement just the day before, doors opening, voices overlapping, questions turning into assumptions, and it did not take long before someone said her name, Deborah, like that would fix it, like authority could just appear and reset reality. And about 10 minutes later she did, her white SUV coming in faster than the others, stopping hard enough to kick up dust that hung in the air as she stepped out, sunglasses on, posture tight, already prepared to take control of the situation. She walked straight to the gate without even looking at me at first, examining it like it was a mistake that needed correcting, her hand hovering near the lock without touching it. And then she turned, finally seeing me standing there. And for the first time since all of this started, that polished expression cracked just slightly, not fully, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for me. Ethan, what is this? She said, voice controlled but edged with something sharper now. And I pushed off the truck and walked forward slow, boots steady on the gravel, stopping a few feet from the gate on my side. This is the access point, I said. Simple, direct, no extra words. She shook her head almost immediately, like the answer was obvious. No, this is the community entrance. We have been using this for weeks, and I nodded once, not disagreeing, just acknowledging what she believed. And then I reached into the folder I had brought with me and pulled out the survey report, the same clean lines, the same measured facts, and held it out just enough for her to see. This road runs through my property, I said, and the words landed. Differently this time, not like a claim, but like a fact that had always been there waiting to be noticed. She did not take the paper, did not step closer, just stared at it for a second before looking back at me, her voice tightening as she said that the HOA had rights, that this had been established, that there were agreements, and I listened without interrupting, letting her build it the same way she had at the lake, because this was the moment where assumption met documentation, and there was no room left between them. I said there are no recorded easements, no shared access rights filed with the county, nothing that grants the HOA legal use of this road. And behind her I could hear the others, the low murmur of confusion growing louder as the reality started to spread from one person to the next. She turned slightly, as if to address them, to maintain control, but there was a hesitation now, a fraction of a second where she did not have the immediate answer, and that was all it took. Because once doubt shows up in a situation like this, it does not stay contained. It moves, it grows, it changes the tone of every conversation happening around it. She looked back at me and asked if I was seriously blocking access to the lake, and I kept my voice even when I answered, I am restricting access to my property, and the difference between those two statements hung in the air heavier than anything else that had been said, because one was emotional, the other was legal, and they knew it. Even if they did not want to admit it yet, a car engine shut off behind her, another door closed. The line growing quieter instead of louder now, people watching instead of talking, and I stepped back slightly, giving space without giving ground, because there was nothing else to argue, nothing else to prove in that moment. The gate was there, the documents were clear, and the system they had stepped into without understanding was now fully visible. And as Deborah stood there trying to hold on to control of something that was already slipping, I could see it in the way she squared her shoulders, the way her voice tightened just a little more. She was realizing that this was not a misunderstanding that could be smoothed over. This was a boundary that had been there all along, and now that it was in front of her, solid and locked in place, there was no easy way around it. The silence after that statement was heavier than any argument could have been. Like the entire situation had shifted from something emotional into something fixed, and you could see it spreading through the group behind Deborah. People stepping out of their cars slower now, not with frustration, but with uncertainty, looking past her toward the gate, toward me, toward the documents in my hand, like they were trying to decide which version of reality was actually real. And Deborah felt it too. I could tell by the way she adjusted her stance, shoulders tightening just a little more, chin lifting like she was trying to hold her position in place. She said, "This does not make sense. We have been using this access for months." The HOA approved it, like approval itself was enough to create a right. And I nodded again, calm, steady, letting the words pass without reacting, because the difference between use and ownership was about to become very clear to everyone standing there. I said, "Using something does not make it yours." And this time I let the sentence sit for a second longer, long enough for the meaning to settle in. Behind her, someone asked what this meant for the lake. Another voice followed, asking about the docks, the improvements, the money they had put into it. And suddenly Deborah was not just talking to me anymore. She was managing a group that was starting to realize they might not have what they thought they had. She turned slightly to address them, voice shifting into that controlled leadership tone again, telling them this would be handled, that there were legal options, that the HOA would resolve it. But there was a hesitation in the way she said it now, not enough to break confidence completely, but enough to weaken it. And that was all it took for the questions to keep coming. Because once people start asking about their investment, about their access, about whether something is actually secure, they do not stop easily. I stepped closer to the gate, not aggressively, just enough to reach the lock, the metal cool under my hand. And I said, "I have already filed the documentation with the county. The access is officially restricted as of this morning." And the words landed clean, not loud, not dramatic, just final. Deborah's expression shifted again, faster this time, eyes narrowing slightly as she processed what that meant, not just in the moment, but moving forward. Because this was no longer a discussion at the edge of a road. This was something that existed, on record, something that would show up anywhere it needed to. And she asked if I was serious about enforcing it. And I met her gaze without raising my voice. I said, "I am serious about protecting my property." And there was no room left after that. No space to negotiate in the way she was used to, because this was not about rules she could interpret or bend. This was about something that existed outside of her control entirely. A car behind her reversed slowly, tires crunching as the driver backed out of the line. Then another followed, not quickly, not dramatically, just a quiet decision made one person at a time. And that was when the shift became visible, not just in Deborah, but in everyone else. Because the moment people start leaving, even slowly, it changes everything. It breaks the idea that this is stable, that this is handled. Deborah turned back toward me, voice tighter now, asking what it would take to resolve this. And that question told me everything I needed to know, because it meant she was no longer certain she could control the outcome. I did not answer right away. I let a second pass, then another, before saying this was never resolved in the first place. And I watched that land, watched the realization move across her face in small, controlled shifts, because this was not something that had gone wrong today. This was something that had been wrong from the beginning. They had just never noticed it until now. The lake was still there, unchanged. The docks still stretching out over the water, the setup still intact. But without that road, it was all disconnected, isolated, something they could see but not reach. And that was the part nobody had considered when they started building, when they started investing, when they started believing it belonged to them. And as I stepped back from the gate, giving them a clear view of it, solid and locked in place, I could see it settling in across the group, not all at once, but piece by piece, like a system they had relied on was suddenly visible in a way it had never been before. And for Deborah, standing there at the center of it, it was no longer about controlling a conversation. It was about facing something that did not change just because she said it should. And in that moment, with the road closed and the questions still hanging in the air, the entire structure she had built her authority on started to feel a lot less permanent than it had the day before. By that afternoon, the road was empty. Not completely abandoned, but quiet in a way it had not been in weeks. No steady stream of cars. No laughter carrying through the trees. Just the occasional vehicle slowing down at the gate, pausing long enough to read the posted notice, then turning around without much discussion. And that shift told me everything I needed to know, because momentum had broken, and once momentum breaks in a situation like this, it does not come back easily. I drove out there again just before sunset, the air cooler now, the light stretching long across the ground, and I could see Deborah's SUV parked off to the side, not blocking the road, just sitting there like she was trying to hold on to a position that had already moved. She was on her phone when I stepped out, pacing a few feet from the gate, voice low but tight. The kind of conversation where every word is chosen carefully, but none of them are solving the problem. She ended the call when she saw me, lowering the phone slowly, her expression controlled again, but not as polished as before. There was strain in it now, visible if you knew where to look. "Ethan," she said, walking a few steps closer, "we need to talk about a solution." And that word landed differently than it had earlier, less authority, more urgency. I leaned against the truck again, not closing the distance, letting her come to the boundary instead of stepping into hers, and I nodded once, listening. She started explaining that the HOA had invested significant money into the lake area, that families were expecting access, that there were already scheduled events, all of it framed like responsibility, like something that had to be maintained, and I let her go through it, because the more she said it out loud, the clearer the gap became between expectation and reality. When she finished, there was a pause, not long, just enough for the sound of wind through the trees to fill the space between us. And then I said, "Investment does not change ownership." Same tone as before, same steady delivery, and she exhaled through her nose, just slightly, the first real sign of frustration breaking through. She said there has to be a way to work this out, some kind of shared access, some agreement. And that was the first time she had moved away from control into negotiation, and I noticed it immediately, because it meant the situation had shifted exactly where it needed to. I reached into the folder again and pulled out a second document, not the survey this time, but the notice that had been filed that morning, formal, stamped, clear language outlining restricted access and unauthorized use. I held it up just enough for her to read the header, not pushing it toward her, just making it visible. "This is already in the system," I said, and she looked at it for a second longer than she had looked at anything else so far, eyes moving across the page like she was trying to find a way around it. And when she looked back up, there was something different there, not confidence, not control, just calculation. She asked what I wanted, and I shook my head slightly, not dismissive, just direct. "This is not about what I want," I said. "This is about what is already mine." And the words settled in heavier than anything else that had been said all day, because there was no angle left in them, no leverage to twist, just a fixed point she had to deal with. Behind her, the lake was still there, still visible through the trees, calm, unchanged, but it might as well have been miles away now, separated by a simple structure that had turned access into permission, and permission into something she could not grant anymore. She glanced back toward it for a second, just a second, but it was enough to show the connection had finally been made, that everything they had built, everything they had assumed, depended on something they never actually secured. She turned back to me and said, "We will have to involve legal." And I nodded once, because that was expected, that was part of the process. Part of the system, she was now stepping into whether she wanted to or not. That is fine, I said, keeping my voice level. And for a moment neither of us moved, just standing there on opposite sides of a line that had always existed but had only just been made visible. And as the light dropped lower and the shadows stretched across the road, I could see it settling in for her, not all at once, but piece by piece. This was not a temporary problem, not something that would be resolved with a meeting or a vote. This was structural, something built into the land itself, and for the first time since she stood behind those flashing lights telling an officer what to do, she did not have a clear path forward. She just had a situation she could not ignore anymore. And as I got back into my truck and the engine turned over, the quiet returned, heavier now, more final, because the conversation had shifted from control to consequence. And that was a direction that only went one way. The legal notice arrived faster than most of them expected, not loud, not dramatic, just a standard envelope in each mailbox with language that did not leave room for interpretation. Restricted access, unauthorized use, immediate compliance required, and within 48 hours the entire tone of that neighborhood changed. You could feel it without even stepping out of the truck. Fewer cars moving, fewer people gathering outside. Conversations happening in lower voices, because once something becomes official it stops being a rumor and starts being a problem. I drove past the entrance late that second evening and saw Deborah standing there again. But this time she was not directing anything, not organizing, not controlling. She was just there, reading a copy of the same notice everyone else had received, holding it tighter than she probably realized. And when she looked up and saw me, she did not walk over right away. She just watched for a second like she was measuring the distance between where she thought she was and where she actually stood now. Then she crossed it, slower than before, no audience this time, no group behind her, just the sound of gravel under her shoes and the quiet of everything else that had stopped. She said, the board had reviewed everything, that they were consulting legal, that they believed there might still be a way to establish access. And I listened, same as before. But this time there was no edge in her voice, no assumption of control, just someone trying to hold on to options that were getting smaller by the hour. I told her she was free to pursue whatever legal route she believed applied. But until something changed on record, the access remained closed, and the way I said it was the same as every other time, calm, even, like it was not a decision I was making in the moment, but something that had already been decided long before either of us showed up here. She looked past me toward the road, then back toward the trees where the lake sat just out of reach. And for a second I could see it all connect for her. Not just the gate, not just the documents, but the entire structure they had built their assumptions on. The idea that usage created entitlement, that organization created ownership, that confidence could replace verification. And she asked one last question, quieter than the others. What happens now? And I let a second pass before answering, because this was the part that mattered. Not for her, but for everything that came after. I said now it follows the record. And that was it. No explanation, no extra detail, because everything else was already in motion. Over the next week the changes became visible in ways that did not need words. The lake sat empty, docks unused, kayaks stacked but untouched, the banner taken down, events canceled. The same place that had been full of noise and movement now still in a way that made it feel smaller, like it had been reduced to what it actually was without that access point. Property values shifted, listings changed language, community features quietly removed from descriptions, and Deborah, the same person who once stood behind flashing lights directing an officer like she owned the outcome, was now attending meetings explaining a situation she could not reverse. And I did not go down there during that time. Not once. I did not need to. Because the point had already been made, not through confrontation, not through force, but through something far more permanent, something that does not change when people disagree with it. And a few weeks later, when everything had settled into its new shape, I drove out early one morning, same time of day my grandfather used to walk that shoreline. The air cool, the ground still holding the night's moisture, and I unlocked the gate, not because anything had changed for them, but because for me it was never about keeping it closed. It was about making it clear who had the right to open it. I drove down that road slow, gravel sounding the same as it always had. And when I reached the water, it was exactly the way I remembered it. Calm, steady, unchanged by everything that had happened around it. I stepped out, took a breath of that same clean air, And for a moment there was nothing else. No voices, no assumptions, no claims, just the lake and the land it had always belonged to. And I realized something simple as I stood there. They did not disappear because I forced them out. They disappeared because the foundation they were standing on was never real to begin with. And once that became visible, everything else followed it out.